Welcome to the Trent England Show. This Tuesday, it is Fake Strike Day number 2. Of course, we were up here on day number 1. If you missed that, talking with some teachers, I'm going to talk about that and respond to a little bit of what we heard yesterday in just a moment. Not as many people here at the Capitol today, as far as we can tell. We have heard that inside the Capitol, it is filled to capacity, and there are some people talking about refusing to leave. The Bernie Sanders campaign joined in the effort, sending out the latest OEA email, and so you've got. I saw even driving in this morning some Bernie Sanders campaign bumper stickers. So you have the Bernie Bro element here, along with the Oklahoma Education Association and various other teachers, students, and that's what's going on at the Capitol. Yesterday, we talked to some teachers and learned some interesting things. And one of those was that a lot of people don't understand education funding at all. So we got to start out with that as we start off the Trent England Show today. We heard one teacher say, well, they funded teachers, but they didn't fund the classroom. And I mean, this is fascinating to hear, the lack of understanding that most of the funding that goes to our schools goes to salary. You can go to the OCPA data tool and you can access state of Oklahoma data. You can slice it and dice it and try to understand it. The bottom line is most education funding is salary, and the biggest chunk of salary is teacher salary. So when people talk about education funding, they talk about per student funding. Teacher salaries is the biggest piece of that, and it's set to be on a per student basis, inflation adjusted, higher than ever before after what the legislature passed last week. So this is important for us to understand. And teacher pay, when you adjust it for cost of living, when you look at teacher pay, well, let's start with nominal numbers. And I've got the chart here. We'll put the chart up from the 1889 Institute. Byron Schlomock, frequent guest on the Trent England Show, put this together. You can see that when you don't adjust for cost of living, Oklahoma has jumped. And this is data coming from the National Education Association. This is coming from the union that is the OEA's left-wing union affiliate in Washington, D.C. Teacher pay in Oklahoma is jumping from being close to, not last, but close to last, jumping up into the, I think, where are we going, into the 30s? When you adjust for cost of living, Oklahoma jumps up ahead of Texas. Oklahoma jumps up into the top 15. Oklahoma becomes the regional leader ahead of Texas in average teacher pay after this last funding increase, after what the legislature passed and the governor signed last week. That is huge. It's a huge increase, and that is money that goes, quote unquote, to the classroom. When they talk about money going into the classroom, the number one thing is teacher pay, is what we pay our teachers. They're at the head of the classroom, right? I mean, that is what we're talking about when we talk about funding for the classroom. But that is perhaps the most misunderstood fact among the crowds that are behind me down here today, is that when we talk about funding for the classroom, we talk about per student funding, the biggest chunk of that is going to be salary, and the biggest chunk of salary is salary for teachers, and that is where this huge spending increase, most of that spending increase is going. Now, I've got a blog post up at ocpathink.org that you should go and read, because I point out the big difference between Oklahoma and Texas is not really how much we pay teachers, especially not anymore after this big pay raise. We're basically on par, slightly lower nominal, slightly higher when you adjust for cost of living. But the big difference is Texas minimum starting salary for teachers is and has been lower than Oklahoma. Very few people understand that fact. So how can Texas have higher average teacher pay? How can teachers move from the state of Oklahoma to Texas and actually make more money? That happens because local districts in Texas have more flexibility on how to spend their funding. They have more flexibility on local property taxes, and they choose to pay teachers more in many, not all, but in many Texas districts, especially in the higher cost of living Texas districts. Those school districts, those school boards, those school superintendents are making decisions to pay teachers in Texas more. And I think this is the one flaw in Oklahoma education policy that has led to what we see this week, has led to the shutdown of schools. I know a lot of people are saying, oh, it's just greed. But look, there's a policy that underlies all this, and that is the policy of trying to detail everything at the state level, trying to impose at the state level teacher salaries and other kind of details of education policy that could easily be left to local school districts. After all, do we trust local school boards? Do teachers trust their school superintendents? Do teachers trust their elected school board members? One of the things that I think we learned talking to teachers and other people yesterday is that if the legislature would have just raised taxes. They passed the largest tax increase in state history, and sent all of that money to school districts, possibly with a recommendation for what teacher pay should be, but a non-binding recommendation. I mean, maybe you require school boards to have a certain kind of vote or something if they want to deviate from that, but let local school boards do the setting of teacher salaries. And this conversation that's going on, all of the yelling that's going on up here, could be probably a much more proactive and much more local focused conversation at local school boards and in local school districts. Wouldn't that be better than turning all the ire on the state capitol? But why are there groups that oppose that? Because you might be surprised, some of the people who oppose that are actually the folks who are leadership in local school districts. They want the legislature to be the fall guy. They would rather have the legislature establish a local salary. They don't want the system where local school districts are empowered the way they are in Texas, because that means they would be responsible. That means they might be held accountable. That means that some of the ire, at least, that we see up around here over the last couple of days that we've seen would actually happen in local school districts. And those leaders, those elected leaders, wouldn't just be cheerleaders for their schools. They would actually have to make real decisions about things like teacher pay. So that is, I think, one of the challenges that we face. The other is just explaining how big an increase in education funding we are going to see in the next year because of what the legislature passed last week. And we've shown versions of this graph before, but I'm going to put up a graph. I just created this. Curtis Shelton, our analyst at OCPA, came up with some of the numbers. And looking ahead into 2019, this is possibly the first numbers you've seen that take what the legislature passed last week and extrapolate that into 2019. There's a little bit of estimating going on here because the state hasn't, the legislature hasn't written the final budget. But these are the best numbers you're going to get at this point. And what do we see? Starting off, when we go back in this chart, we always have to go back before the oil boom, before the natural gas boom, before the massive amount of federal stimulus funds that flowed into Oklahoma. And what you see right before that and then during that, you see an unsustainable increase in school funding that happened in Oklahoma at the tail end of the Brad Henry administration. This was at the same time Brad Henry was cutting income taxes and signing laws that would trigger future income tax cuts. And he was able to do that because natural gas prices were high, oil prices were high, and then the federal government was pouring out stimulus funds to the states, which also flowed to Oklahoma, even though we weren't in a recession. We weren't suffering because of high natural gas and high oil prices. We weren't suffering the way other states were. We still got the stimulus funding. And you put all that together, you see completely unsustainable increases in education funding. And one question that you might ask people who are here today, we might ask some of the people that we talked to, the kind of people we talked to yesterday on the Trent England Show is, how can there be a textbook in the state of Oklahoma? How can there be a desk in the state of Oklahoma that's older than 2009 or 2010 when there was this radical spike in education funding? Clearly unsustainable. Clearly a lot of that was one-time funds. Why didn't they spend that on things like textbooks that last or desks that last even longer? Where did all that money go? That would be a good question. Of course, when that money went away, there was a trough. We see funding levels go down. This is total revenue to education, public schools in Oklahoma. We see those funds go away, revenues go down. That is what we would expect. Revenues are basically held level roughly then, while oil prices are very low, natural gas prices also much lower than they were in the first decade of this millennium, right? And now we see with what the legislature passed last week, those numbers now jumping up to the highest inflation-adjusted per student, highest level of education revenues in Oklahoma state history. That happened last week, and yet we see protests this week. So a lot of people are asking, well, what does all this mean? Obviously, this is not the majority of Oklahoma school districts. I think that's one thing to understand here. We're going to wrap up the show for today with a couple of important facts to understand about what's going on. You've got the Bernie Sanders campaign, you have the NEA-affiliated OEA, you have the AFL-CIO-affiliated AFT, all pushing what's going on here, all pushing to keep as many Oklahoma schools closed as they possibly can. But this is a minority of school districts in Oklahoma. We don't know today. I haven't seen the count today on whether it's a majority or a minority of Oklahoma students. It's probably right around half because it is some of the largest school districts. No surprise. They are the most unionized school districts in Oklahoma. They are the school districts that tend to have more left-leaning faculty tend to have more union membership and union participation. This is going on in red states around the country because these labor union organizations have seen membership declines and funding declines for the last decade or even several decades. That's been the story in Oklahoma. Fewer and fewer teachers want to affiliate with the OEA, want to affiliate with the AFT. They need relevance, and that's what they're working to try to create here at the Capitol. The OEA basically pulling the strings on all of this, trying to make themselves relevant. They're doing the same thing in other red states and other states where unions have seen declining membership, declining revenue. It's no surprise, by the way, that this is happening in a year when we expect the Supreme Court of the United States in this June, by the end of this June, to actually come to a decision, a free speech decision, that no teacher, no public employee in any state can be forced to pay a private political organization as a condition of holding public employment. All of the public sector labor unions, from the NEA to the AFT to the SEIU, all of the public sector labor unions have had this racket for years and years, where they're able, in many states, not in Oklahoma since we passed right to work, but in many states, they're able to actually force people to pay into union coffers, into these political associations, if they want to hold a public job. And if they don't pay, they literally will be fired. And if the public agency does not fire them, the union can sue the public agency and force them to fire workers who refuse to pay unions. All of that is set to be undone this June, and I think is directly connected with what we see going on in school districts from Kentucky to Oklahoma to out in Arizona. This is the political reality that lurks underneath all this. You don't hear that in most of the media reports on all of this. And obviously, most of the people who are here have no idea that that is a part of what is pushing the NEA and pushing the AFT, the AFL-CIO affiliate that is the AFT, that is the union for teachers here in Oklahoma City. That is a lot of the impetus behind efforts like this, what we see in Oklahoma. The question is, are schools going to reopen? Are schools, will the fake strike end? Of course, it's a fake strike because the school districts are actually closed. It's not a strike if your employer tells you you can't come to work. If your employer tells you you can't do your job, it's not actually, it can't be a strike, right? It's a fake strike. The question is, how long will this go on? And what we're hearing up here is a lot of people are pushing to have this go on as long as possible, and are actually saying that they're going to continue this until the legislature passes another round of tax increases. Here's an interesting thought experiment for you. If the legislature had not passed anything last week, had waited until this week, and the union could actually claim credit, if the union could claim that their strike forced what happened last week because the legislature had delayed it and actually did it this week, would we see the strikes continuing? I don't think so. But because the legislature was actually surprisingly proactive and passed the tax increases, passed the funding, passed the major teacher pay raise, for most teachers, $6,000 to $8,000 pay raise, because the legislature did it before the strike and deprived the union of the ability to basically have their strike and then declare victory. Now we see them casting around for even broader demands, even demanding even larger tax increases. We'll see. We may be back here on the Trent England Show tomorrow. We may wander around and interview some more folks even today. So you can keep an eye on the Facebook page for all of that. If you have questions, if you have things you want us to ask, let me know. If you have legal questions about all of this, I know I've helped answer some questions for viewers and listeners out there. Remember, you can subscribe to the show on iTunes. We're on YouTube. We're on Facebook. We're here pretty much every day. I'd love to hear from you on Facebook. Love to hear your suggestions. Thanks to everybody who was watching. We had a lot of feedback yesterday, a lot of positive feedback yesterday, and hopefully I've answered some of the questions that viewers raised after yesterday's show. Thank you so much for watching the Trent England Show.